Bangladesh, a nation forged in the fires of revolution, found itself on the brink once more. The echoes of its tumultuous past reverberated through the streets as the spirit of resistance that had once birthed the nation began to stir again. For years, discontent had been brewing beneath the surface, fueled by economic inequality, corruption, and a shrinking democratic space. The gap between the rich and the poor widened, and the promises of prosperity seemed to elude the common people. The streets of Dhaka, once bustling with hope, now echoed with the cries of those left behind. Students, often the vanguard of change, felt increasingly disillusioned by the political landscape. In classrooms and cafes, the conversations turned from dreams of the future to the harsh realities of the present. The youth, who had always been the heartbeat of the nation, found themselves at a crossroads, questioning the very fabric of their society. The government's grip on power seemed to tighten, while opportunities for the young dwindled. Job centers remained empty, and universities, once seen as gateways to a better life, became symbols of broken promises. The heavy security presence around government buildings only served to highlight the growing divide between the rulers and the ruled. The stage was set for a confrontation. In hushed meetings and secret gatherings, plans were laid and strategies were discussed. The air was thick with anticipation, as the youth prepared to take a stand against the injustices they faced daily. The quota reform movement, which had simmered for years, became a lightning rod for these frustrations. What began as a call for fairer university admissions quickly grew into a broader demand for systemic change. The streets filled with the voices of young leaders, their speeches echoing the hopes and dreams of a generation. Students demanded a fairer system for university admissions, arguing that the existing quota system perpetuated inequality. They believed that merit, not privilege, should determine one's future. The exams, once a symbol of opportunity, now represented a rigged game, where the odds were stacked against the many in favor of the few. The government's response was seen as inadequate, further stoking the flames of discontent. Press conferences and promises did little to quell the rising tide of frustration. The streets became battlegrounds. As police clashed with protesters, each side determined to make their voices heard. The quota reform movement, while significant in its own right, became a symbol of a much deeper malaise. It was not just about university admissions, it was about a broken system that failed to serve its people. The protests began to encompass a wide range of issues, from economic inequality to political corruption, each banner and sign telling a story of struggle and hope. It was against this backdrop of simmering tensions that the student revolution of 2024 erupted. The streets of Dhaka and beyond became rivers of humanity, flowing with the energy of a generation determined to reclaim their future. The confrontations grew more intense, the stakes higher, as the world watched with bated breath. What began as a focused protest movement quickly escalated into a nationwide uprising, capturing the world's attention and forever altering the course of Bangladesh's history. The images of students clashing with police, of massive crowds filling the streets, were broadcast around the globe, a testament to the power of collective action. The events of 2024 would demonstrate the power of collective action, the resilience of the human spirit in the face of oppression, and the enduring allure of democracy. As the dust settled, the streets that had once been battlegrounds became places of celebration. The voices of the youth, once silenced, now rang out in victory, their speeches filled with hope for a brighter future. The peaceful demonstrations that followed were a reminder that even in the darkest times, the light of democracy can shine through. The spark that ignited the revolution came on February 12, 2024. It was a day that would be etched into the annals of history, a day when the youth of Bangladesh decided that enough was enough. The simmering discontent had finally reached a boiling point, and the streets of Dhaka were about to become the epicenter of a seismic shift. Students from various universities in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, gathered to protest the government's inaction on quota reform. The issue had been festering for years, with promises of change repeatedly broken. The students, armed with banners and flags, were united in their demand for a fair and just system that would provide equal opportunities for all. They marched through the streets, their voices rising in unison, demanding justice and equality. The air was thick with the sound of their chants, a powerful chorus that echoed through the city. The students were not just protesting for themselves, they were fighting for the future of their country, for a system that would be fair and just for all. The protests were initially peaceful, a reflection of the students' hope for dialogue and change. They believed that their voices would be heard, that the government would listen to their pleas and take action. The atmosphere was one of hope and determination, a belief that change was possible through peaceful means. However, the government's response was swift and brutal. The authorities, instead of engaging in dialogue, chose to meet the peaceful protests with force. The sight of riot police forming a line, preparing for action, was a stark contrast to the hopeful faces of the students. Police forces, armed with tear gas and batons, descended upon the peaceful protesters, dispersing the crowds with force. The air was soon filled with the acrid smell of tear gas, and the sound of batons striking flesh echoed through the streets. The students, who had come with hope in their hearts, were met with violence and brutality. Images of bloodied students and the indiscriminate use of violence quickly spread through social media, galvanizing support for the protesters and igniting outrage across the nation. The power of social media became evident as the images and videos of the violence went viral, drawing attention to the plight of the students and the heavy-handed response of the authorities. The government's attempt to quell the protests through force backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing the students, the crackdown fueled their anger and determination. The violence only served to strengthen their resolve, and the protests began to escalate. Instead of silencing the students, the crackdown fueled their anger and determination. The sight of their fellow students being beaten and bloodied only served to strengthen their resolve. They were no longer just fighting for quota reform. They were fighting for their right to be heard, for their right to protest, for their right to a just and fair society. The protests grew in size and intensity, spreading beyond the confines of university campuses and into the streets of Dhaka. The city became a battleground, with students confronting police and demanding justice. The movement was no longer just about quota reform, it had become a fight for the very soul of the nation. What began as a movement for educational reform was rapidly evolving into a full-fledged struggle for democratic rights and social justice. The students were no longer just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the future of their country. The protests had become a symbol of the struggle for a just and fair society, a society where everyone had an equal opportunity to succeed. The streets of Dhaka were filled with the voices of the youth, demanding change, demanding justice, demanding a better future for all. The crackdown on the initial protests in Dhaka proved to be a grave miscalculation by the government. What began as a small, localized demonstration quickly spiraled out of control, as the heavy-handed tactics of the police only served to galvanize the protesters. The government's attempt to stifle dissent through force backfired spectacularly, igniting a firestorm of resistance that spread like wildfire. Far from quelling the unrest, the images of police brutality that flooded social media only served to inflame it. Videos of officers beating unarmed protesters, tear gas canisters being fired into crowds, and scenes of chaos and violence were shared millions of times, drawing international attention and condemnation. The brutality on display shocked the conscience of the nation and the world, turning public opinion decisively against the government. As news spread, students in other cities and towns across Bangladesh rose up in solidarity, echoing the demands for quota reform and an end to government oppression. The movement quickly gained momentum, with students organizing protests, sit-ins and marches in cities like Chittagong, Khulna, and Rajshahi. The call for justice and reform resonated deeply with young people who saw in the movement a chance to challenge the status quo and fight for a better future. Within days, the protests had mushroomed into a nationwide movement, uniting students, workers, and ordinary citizens from all walks of life. The movement's message of justice, equality, and an end to corruption struck a chord with people across the country who had long felt marginalized and ignored by those in power. The protests became a powerful symbol of the people's desire for change, drawing support from all corners of society. The streets of Dhaka, Chittagong, Khulna, and countless other cities and towns transformed into seas of humanity as millions marched in defiance demanding change. The sheer scale of the protests was unprecedented, with people from all walks of life coming together to voice their discontent. The sight of such massive, peaceful demonstrations was both inspiring and humbling, a testament to the power of collective action and the resilience of the human spirit. The air crackled with a sense of hope and defiance as the people of Bangladesh, long accustomed to political apathy and fear, found their voice. The energy and determination of the protesters were palpable, as they chanted slogans, waved banners, and stood together in solidarity. For many, it was a moment of awakening, a realization that they had the power to effect change and hold their leaders accountable. The government, caught off guard by the scale and intensity of the protests, seemed paralyzed. Officials scrambled to respond, but their efforts were hampered by a lack of coordination and a deep-seated fear of losing control. The government's initial attempts to dismiss the protests as the work of a few troublemakers quickly fell apart, as the movement's broad base of support became impossible to ignore. The carefully constructed facade of control crumbled, revealing the deep-seated resentment and desire for change that simmered beneath the surface of Bangladeshi society. The protests laid bare the frustrations and grievances that had been building for years, as people from all walks of life came together to demand a better future. The government's inability to address these concerns only fueled the anger and determination of the protesters, who were no longer willing to accept the status quo. The student-led movement had tapped into a wellspring of popular anger, transforming the political landscape and leaving the government teetering on the brink. The courage and determination of the young leaders inspired millions as they stood at the forefront of the struggle for justice and reform. Their voices, once silenced by fear and repression, now rang out loud and clear, demanding a new era of accountability, transparency, and democracy. The tidal wave of dissent had become an unstoppable force, reshaping the future of Bangladesh.